So you're going to give me a tour of the cathedral.
That's right. Also known as the garden. It's the UTOC, or Unified Theory of Knowledge.
Okay.
Then that's the theory of knowledge tree. And even more complicated, the first branch on it is the tree of knowledge system. So my training is as a clinical psychologist. So I got sort of intellectually awakened a little bit in, first off, I skipped school a lot and smoked a lot of pot in high school. So that was that narrative. But I was certainly not thinking that my journey would take me the way it took me. I got woken up a little bit into some interesting ideas in undergraduate. But really my first sort of really turn into the intellectual space was as I was getting trained in my master's program in clinical community psychology, and I was getting taught on how to do psychotherapy. And I was getting then introduced to the major paradigms or models or schools of thought that people use. So in psychotherapy, there are you familiar with any different schools of psychotherapy?
Well, yeah, I read Freud and Jung and and a very, very, the more philosophical ones, the psychoanalysts.
Okay.
I know more
Right.
than, let's say, the more clinical
Right.
types. Yeah.
Right. So those are the depth perspectives, which then Zach Stein, who I think will talk about ensoulment and sort of underneath our social emotional world are these sort of archetypal drives. And so you get Freud and Jung and all the offshoots in relationship to that. And their approach to psychotherapy is, gaining insight into those and appreciating them. But there are a lot of other approaches to psychotherapy. Also, there's a much more straightforward cognitive approach that my mentor, Aaron Beck, developed, which is really kind of in a Stoic tradition that focuses on adaptive thinking. Like, it's not in the world itself, but it's in how the lenses and schema and narrative and the way you think about the world that is key. So how do you become aware of that tendency and make sure you have adaptive cognitive processes that allow you to regulate your feelings and your actions?
And from what I understand, there's kind of a tension, a tension between cognitive therapy, right, and depth therapy, or there's a sort of struggle between the two modes and one comes from a more like pure scientific or empirical model, and the other comes, I guess, from I don't know how you would describe Jung and Freud, because they seem to be, very they seem to be influenced by the arts as much as science. Right?
Well, I mean, certainly Freud starts off trying to develop a scientific psychology. That's definitely what he wants to do. He studies crustaceans and activation inhibition in the nervous system, and he really does want psychoanalysis to be a science. First and foremost. However, what his real impact, although he has an enormous impact on psychiatry and clinical psychology, the science of psychology and Freud were a bit of an oil and water mix, especially, there's a love-hate relationship there. There's a lot of, and so the science of psychology and Freud have always had tension.
Yeah, I remember Camille Paglia saying he should be read as a poet, which is kind of weird for a scientist to be read as a poet, but I guess that's how.
Well, but Freud is such a genius, and he has so many different perspectives, and he builds a Freudian metapsychology that that then opens up so much possibility for how to see the human condition, and then so that he ultimately impacts the humanities, arts, literature. Really in the world, much more than any other psychologist does. But he is then seen as making lots of claims from a scientific perspective that are, well, not exactly up to the coherence and reliability, validity, language game that people in the science world take. So there's just been a longstanding tension. That just gives you one example.
And I guess Jung is more extreme, because I know more about Jung, and I've read more about Jung and I've read his followers like James Kirsch and Gillian, and
sure.
I've read a lot of Jung, and he's even considered more kind of out there, and from the academic point of view. I remember my professors were, they were appreciative of Jung, but they were, they liked Freud a lot more than Jung, because Freud was more easier to
well, right. So if you follow sort of the history, so Jung is really Freud's first unbelievably major student, and he looks like he's going to follow in his footsteps, and then he breaks off, and then analytical psychology, Jungian psychology, then becomes this unbelievable fortress of thought, a cathedral of thought, as it were, not unlike Freudian theory. Now, what happens to Freudian theory, though, is that you get the neo-Freudians. So Jung goes off on his way, and then you get a series of what we study as neo-Freudians that give rise to what I call psychodynamic thought. So that's pulling Freud back into at least the psychotherapy place. So people like Alfred Adler and Karen Horney and Erik Erikson are then, and you'll notice what they are doing is they're taking Freud's depth view. I often like to say that Freud went 2 steps from conscious and really self-conscious awareness into subconscious and then into the deep unconscious. Okay. So that's a 2-step process. And then the psychodynamic people from Adler to Horney to Erikson moved back up really to one level beneath. And what I mean by that is that if you pay attention to what they identify as the core drives of our struggle, it's things like power and love and neurotic struggles about whether or not we'll be accepted. So those individual, and if you look at like the Erikson psychosocial stages, so you get trust versus mistrust, you get autonomy versus shame and doubt, industry versus inferiority. If you look at Karen Horney, she talks about moving toward, moving away, moving against, kind of like power, love, freedom, kinds of themes. And so what you see with those figures is a real shift into a libidinal identity, meaning the energy that really drives you to be relational, okay, and to be connected to things like the genuine conflicts that you have with your parents, as opposed to some of the depth stuff like Melanie Klein really drop into the real netherworld of symbolic fantasy, PH kind of ideas. And so with the depth psychology, what you basically get is you get the Freudian tradition and the Jungian tradition that are both strands of depth psychology. You then get a subset of psychodynamic neo-Freudians that actually move back into the therapy world, that sort of this mainstream therapy world. So those would be the people that when I'm getting trained as, I get trained as a cognitive and a behavioral therapist. I got trained as a humanistic therapist. I got trained as a psychodynamic therapist. I got trained also as a systems therapist, like family systems and social systems impact. And those big 4, cognitive, behavioral, humanistic, and psychodynamic, at the individual level, like I was very enamored with all 4 of those views, meaning that I thought that they had important key insights that should just be available to us from a basic scientific understanding of the way people work. But in fact, that's not the way it works. That they're different models anchored to different gurus and traditions and emphases and fundamental assumptions. So that's what I called the problem of psychotherapy, was that psychotherapy had all of these different paradigms. But when you actually do psychotherapy, you have to, or at least one, very common frame, well, you have to have an identity, you have to have a sense-making scheme, you have to have a way to extract patterns, you have to have some guide, what people call your theoretical orientation to do the work. And what I found, which
is the problem that you're talking about here, that all of these different kinds of therapies, Ericksonian hypnosis and Gestalt, and there's like millions of them, right? They don't have a common language to communicate with each other, and is that the essence of your work, is to try to figure that out? Or
Yep. They don't have a common language or a conceptual structure of understanding that grounds them. Okay. So you back up into the core insights that define them, and they come from very different places of understanding that then frame the puzzle piece of whatever problem. Like a behaviorist comes from the tradition of John Watson and Ivan Pavlov, and then Clark Hull and Skinner. The cognitivists come from a different place. Obviously, you talked about Freud. The humanists come from a different place. Then you also have Gestalt, although actually Gestalt therapists with Fritz Perls come from a slightly different place than Gestalt psychology, and it's just a chaos, of different approaches that don't have.
So then the next question, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll let you run on a little bit more, but the next question would be like. Something to do with the discussion that came up in some of the email threads that we're both part of, is like a unified theory of everything. Like you're trying to create a unified theory, and that's your cathedral. And what are the dangers of that in terms of reductionism and that kind of thing? Like, how do you do that?
Right. Well, that's a
big question.
That's a big question. And I'll tell you. I'll finish the story and then I'll get right to that. Okay.
I'm jumping ahead a bit.
But it's a very good question, and it's good for us to keep in mind, because what I do call my system a unified theory of knowledge. I reference that very clearly in the literature. For some of your listeners, if they're widely read and they're interested in big picture schemes, probably the most influential big picture science book that's been written in modern times is Edward Wilson wrote Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. And he wrote that in 1998. Edward Wilson is the father of sociobiology. He's an entomologist by training. Sociobiology is the process by which you understand social behavior of animals through an evolutionary, naturalistic framework. And he wanted to build a frame. Consilience means harmony and unity. And he wanted to argue that we could create an academic vision that was consilient across the natural sciences, into the social sciences, and into the humanities. That's what his hope was. It was called Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. And my system basically says Wilson's hope for that was good. Wilson's solution was not. He was missing a couple of key pieces, and I offer a consilient vision of knowledge.
So the other guy I know who has a huge theory of everything is of course Ken Wilber and the integral movement. So where does that fit into you? Are you influenced by that? It's interesting. I was thinking about how there are popular therapists. Like there's popular Ken Wilber is very popular, right?
Sure.
A lot of people know who he is and have absorbed his models, and he's created quite a movement. And the same thing could be said for Carl Jung. And yet these people are really they're viewed with suspicion within the academic world.
That's
perhaps for good reasons at times, and perhaps not for good reasons at other times. So I'm wondering like what your like ambitions are. Is it to make it more coherent to the academic world, or is it another one of those big theories of everything that's going to be hard for people to understand? Or, I mean, that's going to be controversial.
Well, we'll see. First, we'll see if it gets known. I will say over the last year, it's gotten a lot more known than it is. I mean, I've been working on this since 1996, 1997 is when my world transformed into this. And really, like I said, it's not the desire or the vision was nothing more than, hey, why do we have all these different things? And if they each have slices of truth, okay, my intuition is to seek coherence. And I want to see if you can put them together in a way, and not really It's just sort of like, why don't they fit together and what would cause them to fit together? That was essentially the deal. And then when I found my path of how to put them together, then what I was being taught was this chaos. Then all of a sudden, it's like you turn a puzzle a couple of pieces, and then all of a sudden a picture pops in front of you, and then you see the whole picture, and you're like, oh, well, that's how it goes together. And now you don't need it. Now it's not really an issue anymore. If you apply particular epistemological frames, meaning how you know, one of the epistemological frames I apply is coherence, and the ability to parsimoniously explain a huge amount with logical internal consistency and effectiveness. And that's
okay, great. Well, then maybe you can start to lay it all out for us then.
Yeah. So, and it certainly relates some to Ken Wilber. I'm often asked, how does my system relate to Ken Wilber? I like his system a lot, and there are some differences as well. Okay.
Okay.
So I started at the problem of psychotherapy. Okay. And then I'm sort of was like, well, let's think about medicine. So psychological therapy is sort of like, should be to what medicine is, which is biological therapy. Okay. So we think about medicine's biological therapy. That means that medical doctors take human biological knowledge. Okay. And then they understand how it goes wrong, and then they treat it. All right. And medicine is pretty well organized. Okay. Meaning that we don't have circulatory doctors competing with gastrointestinal doctors saying, we have the key to all of your health. Just get good blood pressure and get good blood flow. Don't worry about what you eat. And then the gastrointestinal people aren't like, oh no, it's everything about your gut. Okay. The reason is obvious, because we know that the whole system, the whole human organism, is a nested set of systems that go together. Okay. And that we have a general view of health that's anchored to human biology. And all those subsystems are part of the language of biology. Okay. So then it was like, well, shouldn't it be the case then that the different psychological therapies, all right, would be anchored to human psychology? Like human psychology should be the science that organizes psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Right? That was okay.
Well, I'm wondering if the incredible complexity of human psychology makes that a challenge. I mean, the body is already complex, but then, well, I guess the mind is it has another depth of complexity.
Sure. So then I went back and I then asked what turned out to be a life transforming question. I then asked, well, what is psychology? Okay. All right. And it turns out that there's consensus that we cannot answer that question. Okay. I'll say that again. There's consensus that that's an impossible question to answer. So that's interesting. Mm-hmm. That the academy, so the structure, especially at least coming off of Europe into the United States, the structure of the academy is that there's consensus, that there's complete difference, a different opinion. Now, if you go to your
postmodernism, or is that the result of postmodern? I mean,
no.
We know what science is, we know what philosophy is, we know what biology is, but
right, and we know what chemistry is.
We know what literature is generally.
Know what literature is, right? Okay. But the fact of the matter is that although
we don't know what psychology is, that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that some people think that psychology is the science of behavior.
Okay.
Some people think it's the science of mind. Some people think it's the science of mind and behavior. And when you ask people how to define mind and behavior and their relation, everybody, the magnitude of the difference of definitions explodes, and therefore you get a complete breakdown. Yeah. And what you then have, what the actual field is it's grounded not in a subject matter, but in a method. Okay. Mm-hmm. The method of science, i.e. empiricism, the process by which things are measured, reliably tested, brought into experimental, because there's actually a whole field called experimental psychology, which is really the application of the methods of science to whatever this thing we might call mind and behavior might be. Okay. So that's my field and they lie to you in Psych 101. And what they do is just pay attention. They'll say psychology, a lot of people ask these questions. Well, psychology is the science of mind and behavior. The key word is science. Science is about the way you measure things and can know things way more. And now let's talk about science and what that is.
But psychology is not a science, is it? I mean,
well, that's a great question.
Maybe it's something that's very on a liminal space between all of these other things. Like it blends into philosophy. It blends into, if you're a Jungian, it blends into religion. It blends into, spirituality. People say that they're spiritual and not religious. Often they're thinking in psychological terms, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They're talking about their state of mind rather than something religious, or right. Even maybe there is no duality between those two.
Yeah. So then the question is there a way, or so what about that? Why? What do we mean by these terms? What's their history? And then inside, then the fundamental question really that's at the center of my work is that, well, is there a frame within the naturalistic scientific language system? Like how does science play its game of understanding? And within the game of understanding science, is there such a thing that you can call psychology that makes sense? And the unified theory answer is, yep, absolutely there is. And I figured out a way to crack that nut and solve the problem of what psychology is.
Okay. So you're viewing psychology purely within a naturalistic mode, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that we can throw out, all the, the depth psychology, which is usually
no, doesn't mean that. Okay, it simply means what I mean.
Because that's the part I like. I study literature.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So you're familiar some with Ken Wilber, right?
Mm-hmm, sure.
Right? Okay. So you're familiar then with the quadrants, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. The quadrants are on the right-hand side. You have your exterior quadrant, right? At the individual and collective level, and then you have your interior quadrant, right? Yeah. It and its. Okay. Yeah. And Ken Wilber is exactly correct that science, the language game of science, is to anchor yourself in the exterior quadrant at the level of the individual or at the level of systems. So yes, behavior and systems are the two fundamental language systems for science.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. And what Wilber totally rightfully points out is when science took a hold of that, it and its, and developed their matter in motion way of understanding the world. In the Enlightenment, they dominated the crap out of the other branches of philosophy and art, which dealt with the I and the we, right? Mm-hmm. And then they crushed through that dominance. We basically ripped it out, technologically manifested it, and then we lost goodness and beauty and got excessively obsessed with truth and about truth of a particular kind.
Well, we stopped talking about things like the soul, right? You mentioned ensouling and, Zach, we stopped, it became a taboo sort of language to use this kind of mystical terms, which, we could only speak in instrumental terms, right?
Right. Well, right. And from what's called the exterior empirical epistemological language game. So it's like, I quantify it from an exterior empirical way, meaning it's not about qualia, it's about quantity, and I'm going to measure it. It's about inter-rater measurement and reliability that quantifies the exterior objective reality. That's what science is about. Okay,
that's what science is about. But you said that you're fitting psychology within that. How do you do that?
Yeah. So one of the things you have to realize is that one of the mistakes that Wilber makes, in my opinion, is that you do not want to think about the right hand as in terms of physical mechanistic, although that's exactly where science starts, but you actually want to think about it in behavioral terms. In fact, that's the way he usually calls the upper right. Okay. In behavioral terms. All right. Now, behavior is a very different thing than physical mechanism. Okay. Because there's all different kinds of behavior. All right. Okay. So what if you track like Wilber, he'll go from, so there's atoms, and then from out here, it goes all the way up to the brain, in the upper right. All right.
Increased complexity.
Increased complexity up into certain frontal lobes. That's what he'll draw the line. Yeah. From the unified theory perspective, he gets that wrong. Okay. What the tree of knowledge shows, and I'll show you, is that there's an evolution in behavioral complexity from the material dimension. And actually, Wilber's consistent with this. But anyway, there's a matter dimension, there's a life dimension, there's a mind dimension. By the way, that corresponds to the animal dimension of complexity mediated by the brain. Okay. And then there's the culture person plane of existence. Okay. So so at the behavioral level right now, if we are taking a recording of this. We are recording our behavior on this Zoom. Okay. From an exterior empirical perspective, we can take a transcript of our justification systems of interaction. Justification systems refer to the language-based propositional networks that you and I, because we both speak English and have enough of a shared schema of understanding, we can then talk back and forth and open up an intersubjective highway, okay, between our minds. That's what we're doing right now as we talk. Okay. And what that means is that actually, it's not so much just interior and exterior, because there's actually an intersubjective space. I mean, the language-based thoughts that I have are the same form in my head as when I speak them out here.
Well, when you said that, I thought of, there's the I, the thou, and the it, right? There's the there's this, and there's the space in between.
Exactly.
Right. I think John Vervaeke calls it transjective space or something like that. But
he wants to add, right. Well,
that's another element.
So there's the purely subjective perspectival I.
Yeah.
Okay. And from behind my eyes at a phenomenological level, there's the exterior it. Okay. There's the intersubjective we, and John wants to add the participatory transjective, which is, hey, we're actually, not only are you and I sharing an intersubjective understanding, but we're actually now shared in the agent arena relationship of developing a recording for a podcast so that people can have an identity connection and participate in relation. And whatever dynamic emergence happens as you tell me, hey, stop there, or hey, elaborate on this, and I'll respond, and you and I will dance together in a participatory way to be whatever dynamic issues come up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I guess that's the interesting thing about how a conversation as opposed to a monologue is this third element that comes, and that other people that. And widens the whole lens of what can be understood and discovered.
Exactly. So this justification, this was actually in 1996. This is my first sort of point of discovery, was that the shape of your self-consciousness system and the way it gets entangled with language and culture, it really is an organ of justification. So your propositional knowing system is a system of justification that makes us very unique animals. That's, in fact, that propositional knowing.
And dangerous animals. Justification is the most dangerous thing, isn't it? Interesting.
Yeah. So one thing I could do is I could show you the tree of knowledge system and might give you a picture of that.
Great.
You can...
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is a picture of the tree of knowledge system. Okay. Have you ever heard of big history?
Yeah, vaguely. I know about it a little bit. Yeah.
Well, big history is a big picture view of the universe that moves from the Big Bang at the beginning of time up to the present, and then moves from the simpler things up to more complex things. Okay.
Right.
And that's a very good and standard way to map what's called cosmic evolution over time. And the tree, although I wasn't aware of big history when I developed this, the tree of knowledge system can very much be thought of as a map of big history.
Okay.
So let's take a look at what we notice from this map. What jumps out at you right away?
Well, I look at culture and it seems bigger than everything else.
Yes, it's expanding up.
There's an expansion going on.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, and also that the matter is a darker color, so it's more dense. So there's a density to matter, and there's things become more lighter and subtle as you get up into culture.
Okay,
That was just,
good. It's actually, the lightness here is supposed to catch a little bit of a heat reference because there's a little bit more complex activity going on that's lighting it up a little bit. That's actually what the shading is supposed to intuit. But so we see then basically at the very beginning, you have energy. Okay. So at the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago or whatever, you have the beginning of the universe in a unifying, meaning just singular sort of collapsing of the forces and collapsing of all the matter in a radiation energy state. Okay, that's where it starts. Yep. And then out of that is a chain reaction, an inflationary chain reaction that then all of a sudden, essentially you can think about energy getting chunked into frozen bits of matter, which then actually have to occupy space and time. And then you get the emergence of the space-time matter dimension of complexity coming out of the Big Bang. Okay. So, and that is then going to be, this is then a representation, a particular kind of map of the territory then of the material dimension. And then it says, so that took from say 13.8 billion all the way up as far as we're aware. Now, this is the map of the human place in the universe. I'm essentially mapping out our cosmic coordinates here from the human perspective. So if there may well be other life forms out there, and then that would fill in additional aspects of this tree. But right now it maps our own knowledge of our own history. So that 4 billion years ago, there may have been, we're not really aware of any other life form, but around 4 billion years ago, 3.8, certainly by 3.5 billion years ago, we see the emergence of life on planet Earth. Okay. Yeah. So there's a shift, such that by 700 million years ago, so somewhere between 4 billion and 700 million years ago, we see the explosion of the complex adaptive plane we call life.
Yeah. What the hell is that? Life.
Right. Right, exactly. Well, in the language of the tree of knowledge, it's a complex adaptive plane of existence, okay, where the fundamental unit of information is the gene. The fundamental structural unit of operation is the cell, okay? And what the cell does is it metabolizes information, it reproduces and grows, it stores and processes information that's stored in the DNA, RNA, protein relation, okay? And then it communicates with other cells to create this unbelievably different set of complex behavior patterns that we then would see that, oh my gosh, a cell like a bacteria cell, man, does that behave so differently than a molecule? We call life the cluster of behavior patterns associated with this structure of a cell, storage of information in a DNA, RNA, and then their communication patterns between cells that either in single cell organisms, or then we get what's called big life, where you get a eukaryotic cell, and then you get multiple cell creatures like trees and plants. Okay, so 700 million years ago, there was a multicellular, a whole bunch of multicellular living creatures on the planet. Okay. Notice that what made life so different is an information storage, computation, and processing system, and which also set the stage for a communication between cells. Okay. And that information feedback communication network, the way that's processed is very different than what happens at the matter dimension. Although certainly there's information at the matter dimension, there's not a lot of information processing, storage, and recursive feedback and communication. Okay.
Oh, that's very interesting. So the more advanced life becomes, the more communication is going on, the more the more there is this flow of communication happening.
That's right. Mm-hmm. So what you're going to get is you're going to get a increasingly stacked and nested hierarchy, okay, of layers of information feedback that are actually constantly moving up from a bottom-up perspective into a top-down perspective. Okay.
Okay.
And so you go from single cells that don't have a nucleus, and then there's actually a fusion where there are mitochondrial cells that get pretty much absorbed by a larger cell, and then there's a dynamic feedback between those that give rise to the larger big life cells that give rise to things like plants. Okay, and then what happens is that about 550 million years ago, in what's called the Cambrian explosion, we have a fossil layered record where you see the emergence. Before the Cambrian explosion, there were things like jellyfish, okay, that had distributed neural networks. So you see the emergence of a nervous system, but you don't get the emergence of a brain, and they don't have complex active bodies. Okay.
Right.
But at the Cambrian explosion,
so bodies and brains are relatively recent, is what you're saying.
Exactly. Well, if 500 million years is relatively recent, then definitely
relatively recent.
100%, right?
In cosmic time, or in whatever you're calling.
Well, that's exactly right. So when we start to think about the nature of time, our human conception of time, so it's a totally proper statement. But yeah, 500 million years ago or 550 million years ago, we see an explosion of complex active bodies, and you get crustaceans and insects, though not quite modern insects. But basically you see, in other words, they have segmented bodies, they have eyes, they have other sensory input, and they start moving around. Okay. And then the world of mind is sensory motor movement in real time. Okay. And by real time, I mean time that you and I and your dog and my fish over there, that's real time for us as animals. Okay. Yeah. Plants clearly move, but they don't move in the same time scale that animals move in. Okay. Animals move much more quickly and holistically. And what happened is that there are these sensory habituating reflex movement systems that are then connected to sense detection systems. And it's that fusion almost certainly that gives rise to the brain on top of a nervous system. And then you get...
which has a lot to do with motility, right? This is very interesting.
That's exactly right.
That's really interesting. Because we don't see flying trees, do we?
We do not see flying trees. They don't... There are some carnivorous plants. You might know of a Venus flytrap that will eat a fly, and there's a subset of plants that actually do eat animals, but they're they're rare, and they collapse on animals, or they have traps for animals, but they do not get up and walk around. They can't avoid predators. I mean, they can try to send out toxins, and they will communicate. There is certainly plant intelligence, but it's not nearly not nearly the same way that we see in the animal kingdom. So between 500 million years ago and 5 million years ago, you see the evolution of things from worms into things like flies and crabs. And then you see up the vertebrate line from fish into birds and reptiles into birds and mammals. And then 5 million years ago, you get the cousins or ancestors of modern chimpanzees. And if we looked at the great ape kingdom 5 million years ago, we would see behavior patterns very similar to our cousins, the apes today, things like gorillas, bonobos, chimpanzees, orangutans. And that is then that then gives you, that fleshes out the picture. Now I use capitals here. Capital M, mind, is the term I use to denote the activity, the behavioral complexity of the animal kingdom. Okay. So this is a different word, and I definitely spend a lot of time justifying why we need this word. But it's the case that if I look over and see my fish swimming around, in the language of the unified theory, you're seeing mental behavior there. Okay. Mental is the proper adjective that we need to tag on to in front of the word behavior.
Oh, I guess when we think of the brain and we think of, the frontal lobe, that's mental for us, right? Because that's where our abstract thinking process.
Right. Well, there are actually three very different definitions. I like to emphasize that the word mental processes mean three fundamentally different things, okay, depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
So some people mean the most broad and general and more modern definition of mental is the neuroinformation processing activity of the brain, okay, for the mind. So for many, some people mean, what is the mind? Oh, it's the information instantiated and processed by the nervous system, okay? That's one definition, okay? A second definition refers to phenomenology or sentience or subjective experience. Okay. So in this definition, your mind comes back online when you wake up in the morning. Okay. That's your mind coming online.
Consciousness, and then what we kind of call consciousness, right?
Exactly.
So there's this equivocation of many different versions of what we mean by mind. And
right.
It's good to,
right. Exactly.
Hone in on what we're talking about.
Precisely. So I call that mind two. Mind two is what I call experiential consciousness. Okay, that's the felt experience of being. And the work that John and I are doing in that lecture series, Untangling the World Knot. Okay, that's all basically, we're really focused on trying to get the parts and mechanics and generative functions of mind two. Okay. Or the experiential consciousness. All right, and then there's mind three. Now, which is unique to humans and then emerges as a function of proposition and dialogue and justification. Okay, so that's what we're doing now is you and I, we can hook up our mind three highway and talk to each other. Okay?
Can I throw something very unscientific at you?
Please.
Because I don't know, Gurdjieff said we had three brains. He said we're three brain creatures, whereas animals were two brain creatures. And one was motility and one was emotion. And then there was the mind. That's probably a much cruder way of looking at a little bit of what you're talking about.
Completely. And in fact, Paul MacLean talked about, this will make it slightly complicated, but it's actually a little more precise. Talked about the triune brain.
Right, so the triune brain. Yeah, I've heard of that before.
So you have a reptile brain, and then you have on top of that, you have an emotional brain, and then you have a cortical brain. Now that's all in animals, okay? And you can think about that as your acting or doing habit brain, okay, that regulates. Then you're feeling, learning, like in dynamic relation, pleasure, pain, and reliant in the environment brain, okay? And then you're simulating thinking brain that other animals can do. And then on top of that, we humans have a talking mind brain. Okay. So you have doing habits and then feeling, learning, pleasure, pain, and reaction in a dynamic way. That gives rise to the participatory and perspectival stuff of John. And then you simulate across time. That gets you into the cortex. So you can say animals can do this. Certainly, what's going to happen? How do I make a judgment? And then finally, humans get to have symbolic language on top of that, and then they hook up their minds through the talking domain.
Yeah. So symbolic language is a uniquely human sort of
right. It's actually the proper
function.
The proper term, and from a sign, is really symbolic syntactical, because other animals certainly other animals communicate, and they do have fractured symbolic communication. But they do not have symbolic syntactical communication. And that sets the stage for propositional talking, and propositional talking is a game changer.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we come back to here, what we just were talking about was this picture is the evolution of very simple things like worms all the way up to 5 million years ago. This would be all the complex social higher animals like chimpanzees, elephants, and the sort of the most complicated creatures in the animal kingdom that would exhibit the most higher order mental functioning. Usually those are social mammals that are the most complex, although birds and other animals are also very complex. But that's a picture of that. And then between 5 million years ago and the present, and basically really probably fundamentally taking off about 75,000 to 50,000 years ago, we see the evolution of this fourth plane of existence, what I call the culture person plane. Okay, so this is animal mind, cell life, object matter, and now we're up at culture person plane of existence. And that has been growing for at least the last 50,000 years. And it refers to the way in which humans get together and they tell stories and they develop language-based belief value networks that justify what is and what ought to be. And the way they negotiate who's to blame and who should get what, and how do we make sense out of our place in the universe.
I mean, religion and law and I guess we have text, right? Even before that, the alphabet, and then we have text, and so
right. Yep. So first you get for the vast majority of time, this is just oral indigenous. You get animism, okay, at the level of belief value systems. All right. And you get people living in the Dunbar number of 150 plus or minus, but they live in
the original tribe. Yeah.
The original hunter-gatherer tribe. And we live like this, certainly probably pre-linguistically for, millions of years. And then we have a broken symbolic close coordination system for hundreds of thousands of years. And then there's a symbolic syntactical tipping point where you actually make propositional statements. And then the cool thing or the trick of those is that as you make propositional statements, those propositions give rise to questions and what can be called the negative propositional space, which is if I say if you and I are hunting together and I say there, antelope, okay, you can get a sense as to what I mean and we can check that out. All right. But if I say there, antelope, versus there are the antelope. Okay. When I make a meaning-based propositional claim, all right, that now creates a structure, an epistemological structure that says, oh, this is either true or not true. Okay. Which is called the analytic problem of justification, which is like, well, how do you know that they're over there? Maybe they're over here.
Wow.
Okay.
So that's interesting to me because that means that human beings are concerned with truth, whereas animals have no real conception of. There's no notion or concept of truth in the animal world, is there?
Certainly they'll get some sense of deception and other kinds of issues. Yeah, but when you make propositional truth claims that can then be analyzed, you have jumped up a level that of truth relatedness that is very different. I mean, try to do it with your dog. How do you have an engagement about the concept of truth with your dog? Okay. That's not easy. It's really easy to love your dog and play with your dog and get your dog to be upset with you or be upset with your dog. All of that's really, but to get a truth proposition and then analyze that at all, that's, clever experimental animal psychologists have done some things that certainly can show animals can manipulate and simulate. But as my friend Joe Mikulski, who's worked with me some on this, although this was certainly my idea, he happened to have a good meeting with Jane Goodall about 2 years ago. They invited her to his university and he was the dean of a college. And so he got to have lunch with her. And because he's familiar with my theory, he asked her, well, you spent a lot of time. She's like, oh my gosh, do these chimps have such complicated and rich lives? And he was like, well, do they ever justify their actions? She's like, no, never. I've never seen anything like that. Okay.
Right. They don't have the existential question of who am I, or they don't have a question, right? Also,
that's exactly
sort of what defines us as human is this primary question, like who am I? What's going on here? Right. What's this all about?
Exactly. In fact, I would actually say that's what defines us as persons. There's a cool concept or analysis by a descriptive psychologist by the name of Peter Arcerio, who really argued that the unique thing about what defines a person is an entity that can be self-conscious and justifies his or her actions on a social stage. Okay. And what's cool about that is, although empirically the only creatures we have seen to be persons are human beings, science fiction, and creative people have generated many examples of persons that are not human beings.
Aliens.
Like aliens in Jabba the Hutt. And you'll notice that they all have this ability that they know who they are and they justify to other people what they're doing, and they manipulate others, and they talk. But that's the defining feature, really, of personhood. So I often will say that we human beings are both primates and persons. And
cool.
And that's actually so
makes sense to me. Yeah. Yeah.
So then the argument here is that about 50,000 years ago, this idea is what I'm explaining to you is called justification systems theory. And it's the joint point that turned us from primates up here into persons and gave rise to the evolution of this culture person plane of existence. Okay. And then these cultures are systems of justification. And what the tree of knowledge says is there's a particular kind of justification system that emerged about 500 years ago, okay, that we call science. And what science does is it tries to develop an objective map of cosmic evolution across time. Okay. So the tree of knowledge is a theory of reality mapped by matter, life, mind, and culture. And it's a theory of science that maps reality.
Okay. Do you think that science...
I'll stop sharing this.
Do you think science does away with religion in that sense? Or I mean...
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I think that...
Because I think a lot of scientists think that, right? A lot of scientists think that at that point when we developed science, religion became a fantasy, illusion. I don't believe that personally, but...
Well, I'll put it this way. So certainly the scientific worldview was a big blow to simplistic, dualistic worldviews.
Okay, great. The like what John calls the two worlds mythology.
100%.
Dualism and religion. There's
exactly. So one of the big jumps from the pre-modern formal world, especially this is much less true in the East because of the nature of the justification systems and philosophies that emerged there. But in the West, of course, we had the Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman fusion tradition in scholastic European traditions, and it was Christian-dominated metaphysics, right? And that at least the vast majority of people that interpreted that somewhat literally, there was a dual world God and the real world, and science basically does pop a lot of that bubble. Okay. And so
I've been studying, Jewish mysticism a little bit, and you have the tree of life in Jewish mysticism, and there's a kind of there's a sort of evolutionary model there, but at the same time, it's understood that. There's different versions of that, in the Jewish mysticism. Some of them are very dualistic, and others are more monistic. It's like the whole model becomes transparent at a certain point.
Right.
It makes any sense, but I find that a lot of these things which exist in the East are hidden in Western traditions as well. It's just that we've been brought up with this very dogmatic, narrow version of the Western traditions, or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the way I think about it, without being pejorative, is that you need, certainly in the West, based on these, you needed a fairly concrete version of reality for the church to have its authority, and that God looked above you and he cared about what you did, and would watch you. And if you were good, you'd go to heaven, and you were bad, go to hell. Well, that was a fairly concrete picture, and that many people, given education and capacity and everything else, and certainly for children, there you go. You needed that
functioned. Yeah.
You need that function, and they needed that level of concreteness. They didn't have a lot of other justifications competing with that. as you get into it and you get the intellectuals really studying this, right? And then you start to make, well, what do you really know about God? What kind of descriptive can we really say about what God is? And then very quickly it's like, well, it's a very abstract concept, right? I mean, anybody that starts saying, I know that God wants this or does this, or God is this way at a very high level of intellectual function, you start saying, how the hell do you know that? Right? So God recedes into abstraction. And then you get a Spinozoa kind of view. For many people, it's sort of like, whoa, nature becomes, or there's some force, but it's more than that. So I think many traditions go into sort of an abstract monism of sorts, where God is everywhere and nowhere. Because when you really start to get deep into it, you realize, the bearded guy in the sky is for children.
Yeah, it's for children, but there are more sophisticated versions of theology than that, certainly.
Of course, and I think that the Dawkins and Sam Harris of the world basically killed the child version, and science killed like the utility,
which is pretty much a straw man, and pretty easy to do, right? It's pretty easy to prove the non-existence of Santa Claus on a literal level. Like
that's right, but the archetype of Santa Claus. Right. Mm-hmm. The archetype of Santa Claus and the archetype of God. And this is why I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson's Bible series. I mean, my thing's a tree in a garden. Okay. I'm not lost on that mythology. In fact, that's the whole point, is that I want people to weave together the logos of the tree of knowledge and then cultivate a mythos of the garden, and a return to what could be, my vision of realistic paradise in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I feel that somehow religion and science became completely split off from each other. And there has to be some kind of re-emerging of the two, which is very complex and difficult.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Ken Wilber does a really good job.
Sure.
In his work.
Sure.
I don't share all of his ontology, but I totally agree that science and the right-hand side of that, of his quadrants, came overly dominant and dismissed the I and the we and the good and the beautiful. And we need a balanced, in fact, I talk about a scientific humanistic philosophy that's appropriately balanced across concerns of truth, goodness, and beauty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So what's next after your model? what do we do with this model? What is its utility, and how? You're talking about a unified theory of psychology. How does that work?
Right.
I mean, I'm sure that's a big question, but can you give us a?
Sure. Well, let's go back into, so now let me bring it. So I'll put it this way. That's the first branch, what we just covered on the tree behind me. Okay.
That's the first branch. Okay.
First branch. Okay. There are 8 branches and then the yellow flower in the middle. Okay. So if you see in the back, and I could pull up the whole thing, but I don't want to get too far into the weeds because I want to stay also engaged in relation, right? So the left side of the branch of the tree refers to the unified theory of psychology, and that's the science side, okay? Mm-hmm. And then the right side of the tree refers to the unified approach to psychotherapy. Okay. All right.
Okay, I see. So you're splitting psychology and psychotherapy into two different domains, which makes sense because psychology will remain within the realm of science, and psychotherapy can go in all these other spiritual directions, etc. Right?
Brilliant. Exactly.
I get it. Okay.
Uh-huh. And indeed, you can also, if you're from a Kantian tradition, the left side's about pure reason, and the right side's about practical reason. Okay.
Okay.
And if we then jump to the other side, to the 8th branch, that black dot. Mm-hmm. All right. The black dot is a symbol of mindfulness. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mindfulness. And so there's an integrative approach to psychological mindfulness.
Why is mindfulness symbolized by a black dot? That's very interesting.
Well, you can only see it's actually an eye looking down if you get into the detail. So inside that black dot is an outline of an all-seeing eye. And the idea is that it symbolizes a metacognitive observer. Okay. So mindfulness is the ability. So here you and I are in conversation. A metacognitive mindful stance steps outside the stream and then studies the stream between us from that perspective. So it then, boom, you then put up. Okay. So mindfulness is about, so that's what it symbolizes. Step outside the stream and become a participant observer in your life. The model is called CALM-MO. Okay. MO stands for both metacognitive observer. So that's the symbol. Okay. And also MO, like make sure you have that as your modus operandi.
Okay.
And then calm is of course the word. And then that says, hey, be aware of your calm body, calm mind, calm spirit, as opposed to closed and defensive, get calm. All right.
Okay.
And then it's an acronym that stands for curiosity, acceptance, loving compassion, and motivated toward valued states of being.
Okay. Because I've been practicing Buddhist meditation since I was 21, and I always object when people describe meditation as some sort of, because they probably have never done a Zen sesshin if they think that Zen meditation is to get you into a state of calm. Because
right.
So I don't want to be critical here of your model.
No.
It sounds fine, but I sort of think of I think that tranquility and calmness, that might be a byproduct of what's going on, but you're also you're sitting there with a molten ball of burning lead and you have a sword and you have to cut the knot of eternity, and so I don't like this new age version of meditation.
Right. And there's there's meditative mindfulness, which I don't do, although I'm all for, I've done some, but I'm no meditator. Okay. This is psychological mindfulness. Okay. Is a slightly different angle. They're both concerned with being aware and emphasize elements of acceptance. So mindfulness means rather than mindless reactivity, we are going to have awareness of observation of what is present.
Yeah.
Psychological.
That's called the witnessing consciousness or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So mindful meditation is a practice in the witnessing muscle. Okay.
Yeah.
So what you do is you maintain your capacity, your will to attention to the witnessing muscle and to bring the witnessing function back online. That's drawing your attention back to breath, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So psychological mindfulness refers to the capacity. It's much more in the logos domain, where as opposed to the perspectival witnessing function. Okay. And it's essentially from a John Vervaeke perspective, it's essentially activate your inner sage. Okay. Okay. So it's like, what would Socrates?
It's about wisdom rather than just observation, right?
Well, yeah. And what's right. Wisdom actually means cultivating knowledge and practice toward valued states of being, which is the M in calm. Okay. So it's like, what are your valued states of being in the short and long term? And then how would you get curious about what is going on? How do you learn to accept if it's something shitty's going on? How do you be present there? How do you engage in loving compassion? And then how do you find that adaptive path toward valued states of being in the short and long term? So it's engaging wisdom, say an internalized sage.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Yeah.
So that gives you an example of sort of like, does the garden tell you what to do? Well, I mean, it's not like a simple, do these 10 things and life is fine. Okay. But it carries with it a whole set of maps, an ecology of practices. And CALM-MO provides some of the frames of reference on that.
Okay.
So those are two good aspects of the cathedral, as it were. Those are two good rooms. ComMO is one. The tree of knowledge certainly is. There's a lot of layers to both of those, but particularly the tree of knowledge.
And okay, so take us to some more rooms. I think you should put this up on the screen. I think people might like the visual of it as you're talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So let me see where I am here. So let me share my screen with you.
Yep.
If I go to this one. Yeah. Okay. So this particular
I can see something that says a journey with my daughter.
Yeah, actually.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Actually, yeah, the garden, when this popped, this was 2016. And I was working, I had the unified theory and the unified approach, and they both had 4 ideas. So the unified theory of psychology and the unified approach. And I was at a conference called Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self. And the globally sustainable self, they were discussing that, and a really good African man from Africa talked about African philosophy called Ubuntu. Okay, right. That's it means toward humanity, cultivating a sense of brotherhood, sisterhood. Yeah. And I had been calling my system in the last, like
it means what's mine is yours, doesn't it mean something like that?
Yeah, right. It's a flow. It's a flow between self and other that creates goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. And an attitude toward that. Okay. And that was actually and I would be calling my system, which was UTUA. And then I was just shrinking that to Atua. And everyone's like, what the hell is that? What a weird word, Atua. And I was like, oh, it's this, that, and the other. And then I heard Ubuntu and I was like, oh my gosh, we should plant Atua seeds and grow Atua trees. Okay. And what I meant by that is to cultivate the globally sustainable self. What we need to do is we can share this schema and we can share it with the children. Okay. And then that created an artistic calling in me, which I've never had really. I've never had and I don't do much in the way of music. I drew a little copying stuff. I have a vision logic, to use a Ken Wilber term. That's why I draw all my schematics, but I never had an artistic calling. But this is what happened to me. It awoke something at the artistic space. And actually then it ultimately started, I brought it home, my daughter, we were talking about various gardens and trees and flowers. And it ultimately set the stage. So then this is the first thing that I built. Okay. So we talked about the tree of knowledge system. That's the far left. Justification hypothesis actually became justification systems theory later. That's the second. We were talking a little bit about that. Behavioral investment theory. That's a third branch. Thing called the influence matrix. And then a thing called, so that's those 4 make up the unified theory. And then character adaptation systems theory, or CAST, the character wheel of development, the nested model of well-being, and ComMO. Those make up the unified approach. And this was the first, like, hey, if it's a tree, what does it look like? And then my daughter encouraged me to put flowers on it and then use the visual diagrams that it would become. And then it grew and grew from there. And then it grew ultimately into the current representation of the system. Okay. And then ultimately it grows into a whole garden where each of these, the bees and the what's called the stepping stone and the me flower in the middle, they all have very clear reference and symbolism. And
what's the me flower in the middle? I think you mentioned that briefly, but
yes. So what it stands for, if you we'll see if you zoom in a little bit on it. Yeah. Well, anyway, you can see it right there. You see it's a yin yang symbol. Okay. The M stands for metaphysics. And the E stands for empiricism. Okay. And it's the relationship between metaphysics, which is your concepts and categories, and empiricism, which is the data you pull through your senses. and it's about creating the proper relationship between our concepts and categories. Okay. It's also in the shape of a big one in the middle. That's called the big me, which is the big justification system of concepts, categories, and data. And then little me's represent each individual. Okay.
Wow.
So you can think about your own Andrew Sweeney's concepts and categories. And
so they're like sub-personalities or something like that? Mm-hmm.
No, well, each of us is our own small one, and then we would get together. And this is true of any belief system. So you'd have individuals that then make up Christianity. Each Christian would be an individual. Okay. But then they would get together and make it up. And then the question is, how do we create? One of the things is, creating a big picture that connects to each of us as little pictures to create the whole.
Okay. So that's sort of a representation of a community kind of.
Exactly. Like another feature of this is that it spells M-E-M-E, okay, as a meme. So to create a memeplex, a metaphysical, empirical, big, small memeplex. That's a artistic representation. Okay. So that's another idea, is like we need a meta memeplex for the 21st century that collects the large scale systems of justification and the individual level systems of justification, harmonizes them in a dialectic. Okay. And then that's part of them where we are in the 21st century. That's the calling of it.
Mm-hmm. It makes me also think of the left brain, right brain model of McGilchrist, and the metaphysics being more of a right brain kind of associative mind, and the left brain being the more empirical type of mind. No, is that something?
Yeah, I think
I'm throwing. I'm really stretching it here. I probably.
Well, you're not stretching it really at all. I just actually would twist it just a little bit, because I totally get what you're saying, and you're absolutely right. But there's another layer that kind of inverts it. But let me say that the left side of the tree is your left brain. Okay, yeah. So that's your logical brain. All right, and the right side is more of the intuitive, practical brain that's embodied. Okay, so that's totally okay, and so that's right. The interesting thing about metaphysics really is it's really your linguistic concepts and categories, and empiricism, as I mean it in your body, I mean through your perspective, which actually is a much more right brain phenomenology. Okay. So when we're talking about internal empiricism, that's you opening your eyes and seeing a red can. Okay. And really and then your concept that's a red Coca-Cola can is actually part of
more in the metaphysics. Oh, I see. Okay.
Exactly. So that's why actually it is really metaphysics is a little bit more left brain concepts and categories. Okay. And versus right brain phenomenological and first person interior empiricism, as opposed to, although I mean it in both senses here. So it's, there's multiple layers to the system in that regard.
I see. Yeah.
Okay. So then basically what this says is the garden, the word atua comes from the combination of UT and UA, where UT stands for the Unified Theory of Psychology, and UA stands for a unified approach to psychotherapy. In the garden, you find the stepping stone that actually stands for the standard theory of elementary particle physics. So that grounds it in physics. The metaphysical unified theory, unified approach theory of knowledge tree. That's the long version of it. The UTUA, or Atua flowers, Atua seed, and the two Atua bees, the wicked wisdom bee and the wick WB. And their symbolism. The garden's artistic representation of a system of knowledge that offers a novel way to unify modern science, psychology, and philosophy into a coherent scientific humanistic worldview. It's scientific in the sense that it offers a map of the universe that's consistent with modern scientific knowledge, from quantum mechanics to sociology. It is humanistic in the sense that it embraces value-based living, meaning-making, creative expression, and the concept of the sacred. As such, the garden provides a place for the two cultures of the academy, the sciences and the humanities, to come together in a mutually inspiring dialectical dance.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Because again, we're living in an age of where these two realms are split almost schizophrenically.
Completely.
Yeah.
So this gives you sort of a frame of the components. There's also, I did a thing called the I-Quad coin and the elephant sun god around the garden. Let me go, I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit because if I get too much in the weeds here, but I want to at least show you the 8 key ideas, okay? And then we can see where to go from there. All right, so the WIC B stands for wisdom, interest, character, and well-being, all right? If you want to say, well, what fundamentally is the message of the garden? The garden's about cultivating these 4 elements. So I want to cultivate wisdom. I want to cultivate interests, meaning, okay, what are resources? What are needs? I want to cultivate character and cultivate well-being. Mm-hmm. Each one of the branches has a core word associated with it. Okay. So we have knowledge, justification, investment, influence, adaptation, development, and well-being. All right. Mm-hmm. And then there are 8 key ideas. This should pull from the idea of the eightfold path. All right. And getting right relation with various elements, got to overlap with that. Mm-hmm. And the first branch then was what we covered. That's the tree of knowledge. Okay. And that's the new map of cosmic evolution. And that actually provides the proper descriptive metaphysics. I was just in a conversation with Bard on the list as to why I actually need the word metaphysics. And Bard was like, no, you don't need that. It's like, actually, I do. Bard and I can banter. I appreciate what he's saying, but I do need descriptive metaphysics. And this is a descriptive metaphysical system, meaning it defines the terms and categories in a particular way. This is the second branch of the tree. Okay. And it represents justification systems in what's called the updated tripartite model of consciousness, human consciousness. Now that's a direct reference to Freud. Okay. And what this is as a model of consciousness, you have the behind the eyes experiential self. So this is your screen of awareness. Mm-hmm. Okay. That is your sensory consciousness. And it also then plugs in to what's called your episodic declarative memories of self, which is sort of your point of view of being in the world. And what you remember would be your core phenomenological self. Okay.
Oh, okay. And that's different from your private self in what sense?
Uh-huh. So your private self in this context refers to your private narrating self. So this is what's mediated by language and how you talk to yourself. Okay. And then that's what you can directly share through the information language highway that gets opened up with language, so that just like you and I are talking right now, I can take my private narrating selves and they go right through the skin and in their propositional language content, and will get dropped right in your head. Okay. Unlike my experiential self, which you can never gain direct access to.
Which is the subconscious in Freudian terms, isn't it?
Yes. Now, Freud is actually not super clear. His topographical model needs work in the sense that he does not differentiate clearly between self-conscious narration, which he normally means by consciousness, and consciousness at the level of experience, okay, which he generally means by subconscious. All right. But it's not really clear always versus that and then into unconscious. So I would argue you absolutely need experiential consciousness and self-reflective consciousness. Those are 2 different domains of consciousness.
And what about the collective unconsciousness? Where does that belong in here?
Excellent. Hold that thought. I'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
Okay. So
to bring Jung in the story.
Yep. Now I'll bring a psychodynamic version of Jung in, then we can go deep into Jung in relation. Okay. Mm-hmm. But at the second branch level, then you'll notice one other thing about 2 other things I'll share. So this is your attentional filter into the experiential stuff. Again, this map between and so underneath the attentional filter is your neurocognitive processing. Okay. Mm-hmm. The neurocognitive processing is the non-conscious information processing that your brain's engaged in. All right. That's regulating and translating your muscles into action and also communicating a network behind the scenes, backstage, and doing all of that. Okay. This then creates a tip of the iceberg, but very important part of our mind's experiential consciousness. The relation can be thought of as an intentional filter. We can debate about the term, but basically, what is it that brings it onto this stage of awareness? Okay. And then there's a relationship between what you're self-consciously aware of and what you're willing to bring onto the stage and how you narrate it. I call the relationship between that the Freudian filter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then what do you actually share relative to the public? Okay. And what do you hide? When do you lie? When do you deceive? When do you worry about judgment? When you try to put on a face? The filtering between those two domains is called the Rogerian filter.
From the therapist, Rogers, from him, I guess?
From Carl Rogers.
Carl Rogers, right.
Yep.
Okay.
Because what Carl Rogers identified as the split between your social self and your core, what he called your core organismic valuing process, or we could just call it your true self. Okay. That social split where people, because of conditional love and judgment, you put on a face and that becomes your fake social self. And then that's disconnected from who you truly are. So Rogers tried to create a therapeutic environment of unconditional positive regard, non-judgment, empathy to break through the Rogerian filter and create a connection into what the person fundamentally felt at their core. Okay.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. So that's, because there's a sort of wall of perception between you and the other person, unless you're able to penetrate that wall.
Exactly. With empathy, and positive regard. Okay.
Yeah, got it.
And all of this is taking place in a sociocultural historical context called the context of justification. So like a therapy room and the professional relation. So you don't sleep with your therapist, or are you at home? And what's the rules of the family? Are you in Saudi Arabia versus Northern Virginia? Okay. So that's all context of justification, which sets the rules of engagement from a cultural perspective.
Okay.
Great. So this is the third branch of the tree. Okay. And this is how the brain turns into the mind, meaning the mind at the level of neurocognitive functional processing. So in other words, how does information get processed by the brain? And this is then an architecture of the neurocognitive function of the human mind. Okay. And what means that it detects input, and then translates them into sensation. And I don't necessarily mean experience sensation. I just mean the language of the nervous system. Architecture of the human mind. So this is, instead of consciousness, this is a map of cognition. All right. Neurocognition. And basically that's like, okay, when you put inputs into the function, what's the brain activity and what's the output that you get? And then how does that processing seem to work? Okay. And this basically maps it according to 4 levels and 3 levels of memory. Okay. The 4 levels are, the first is this reactive level. Okay. And then you have what's called the operant experiential. That means this is the more conscious level of feeling. Okay. Where you get perception of the outside meeting the inside. All right. Which then connects to your drive, to what you want to see versus what you don't want, or what you want to approach versus what you want to avoid. Okay. And then the relationship between where you are inside and out and what you want to avoid activates emotion, or energizes motion. Okay. And the most obvious example is pain. All right. So pain is an intersection of where you are, where your body is, what you definitely don't want. And then your emotion is escape from that. Okay. So pleasure and pain form the base, and then that grows into your positive and negative emotion system. Okay.
Great.
And this is then very connected to what B.F. Skinner on the outside talked about in terms of the operant, which is reinforcement and punishment and all that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then you get up into higher brain levels, and then this is the ability to then not just be responsive to rewards and punishments in the world, but to have a cognitive map of the world and be able to simulate your interaction with it and see what you can get out of it through imagination and planning. So you manipulate the world, and then you plan and inhibit. This is like
and maybe that has something to do with metaphor. Does it? Like you can.
Sure.
Yeah.
We're still talking. The way I like to think in evolutionary terms. So right now I'm still talking like climbing up from, say, jellyfish and then into fish and birds, and now we're into birds into mammals. So this is a higher thought.
Okay.
So like if we're at like a rat, actually I just happen to have a book right here. This book is called The Mind Within the Brain. And what this guy studied is like when a rat comes to a maze, a T point, that's like it can go left or right, it will simulate the path of least resistance and the out reward on the right-hand side.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Okay. So that's planning, and then it's got to inhibit its action and then select which one it does depending on its anticipated reward in the future.
Okay. So metaphor is a higher level probably then.
Yeah. So I think to really get into, then you get into the level of justification. Now this is, so your right brain then really organizes around this stuff. And then for humans, you tack on the left brain that gets plugged into. Now in animals, you see the attention to the part in the context of the whole. Animals have this brain differentiation, but then humans tag on language on top of the part whole analysis. And then that gets plugged into the left hemisphere language. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then that's linguistic justification. So you basically have the doing, reacting, the feeling, learning, the thinking, imagining, and then the talking. Those are your 4 levels, okay, on the hierarchy. And then you have a distance in terms of memory. So you have an immediate sensory motor awareness, like basically between half a second and 3 seconds. That's on the screen of consciousness. Then that's called sensory perceptual consciousness. And memory. All right. Then you have working memory, which goes to about 20 seconds. And that's kind of like a whiteboard that you can bring up and manipulate, like when you're trying to remember a phone number. Okay. And you can move stuff around on your working memory. And then you store stuff almost infinitely in your long-term memory. And consistent with this, you have 3 different kinds of memory. You have procedural memory, which is like embodied fixed action patterns. That's like tying your shoe, okay, or learning how to ride a bike. Episodic memories are the perspectives that you have that are important to you in the world. Like if you had a fight with your wife, or you were rejected sometime, or you accomplished something. All right, those are meaningful episodes. And then your semantic memories are your memories for fact. And when you're developing your narrative, you yoke together your semantic memory for declarative fact with the position to give you rise to an autobiographical memory of story of the self. So this is called your justification narrative. This is the story of why Andrew does what he does and why other people should treat him a certain way or all that. Okay. So this is your map of your human cognition. The other one's a map of human consciousness.
Okay. Very good.
Now, this is a map. Then you talked about Jung and archetypes. Okay, this is a map of the human relationship system. All right. Let me go back to this one real fast. You see this level of perception, motivation, and emotion. Okay. Now that can be for non-social things like, oh my gosh, I'm thirsty. I'm going to perceive something. I'm going to approach it. I'm going to grab it. If I gain access to it and feels good, I got my thirst and I feel positive. Okay. But we also have architecture for not just the non-social material world, but also the social material world. Okay. And what this is this is the architecture for your motivation in the yellow. This is what you want to approach and what you want to avoid. And these are elements of that. And then the emotion is on the outside. This is what then tells you whether or not you're moving in the right direction or how things are changing. Okay. So what it says is here in the center of this thing is the black line. And this is called the influence matrix. So it's a map. You heard the term internal working models ever?
I've heard the term. Yeah, sure.
Okay. It just means the pictures that you have, the episodes that you have and models that you have in your head about how other people will treat you. Okay. And what you see there is that you'll see yourself in relationship to the other and the kind of pattern that you expect. Are you going to be trusted or mistrust? Okay. Like that's an Ericksonian first phase. All right. Are you an industrious person that's successful, or are you inferior? All right. Are you going to be, there are a whole host of them. Are you going to develop role identity, or are you going to develop confusion, or role confusion versus identity? Are you going to be isolated, or are you going to have intimacy?
Okay. What this maps is it says the core of what you're actually seeking is what's called high. This is the social influence and relational value line. Okay. Which basically means, hey, do you have good influence and are you known and valued?
Yep.
And what you have is a template for what it would be like to have high relational value and social influence. Okay. Like think of the successes that you have. You put down together the Parallax, podcast, and it's great. And all of a sudden everyone's like, Andrew, we love this. Okay. That would be like, oh yeah, all right. I'm proud of this. This is something I want to share. And then other people see me for me, value it, and attend to me and give me attention. Then we'll feel good about that.
Yeah.
Okay. If you put it out, you put a lot of work in, and people say it sucks or don't pay attention to it, then you feel wounded by that at a social, emotional level.
Got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So it's kind of your relationship to your ego in some way as well, right?
Well, so what you see with kids at first initially is that they will track this with their parents. And if they have a good, secure relation, that basically means they're getting signal that they're known and loved, and the parents will protect them, and they'll get a secure base. They'll have a secure felt feeling of being loved. And if not, they'll get insecure, and then they'll get defensive.
Yeah.
Okay? That's what happens to them at first. And then they move to their peers, and they basically ask the same question. Am I going to be known and loved in my peers or not? Then they move to significant others and themselves when they move into adolescence, meaning that they get a secondary self-concept. It's like, what's my self-esteem? And the reason that so many people go crazy when they're in adolescence is because they start having that second order analysis of their own selves. So they will think differently about themselves. And do I like myself? Okay. 5-year-old kids don't think like that. They basically just take what other people treat them as. But adolescents and then into adults will carry a separate self-concept.
It becomes more reified and
exactly. It's because that narrator back in here, this narrator becomes much more present and holds you through time. That's your adult identity, and it merges in adolescence. And then you think, oh, I now have a concept of what I should be, and now I reflect myself. 5-year-olds don't do that.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess that affects your private self and your whatever the subconscious was. I forget your
exactly. It's really a map. This is the yellow circle influence matrix maps some of the really key dimensions. And we talked then about, well, where does the experiential, where is it guided? And you can think about sort of the hero archetype. Okay, you can see actually in this left-hand corner that has anger, pride, self. This is a much more masculine corner. Okay, the self-oriented, and down here is the feminine, other-oriented. Okay, so your mother and the love and the more father pride archetypal structures. So the archetypal structures of male-female, of hero, of failure, of all of this. These will have embodied self-other patterned relations, and the influence matrix traps the process dimensions around the central dimension of high versus low relational value.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. And this really connects the underlying subconscious or animal conscious and its social world, then with the conscious, self-conscious justification world.
Okay.
Right? Because you're trying to justify yourself on the social stage, and you have to worry about your own self and your influence that you have and your own investments, and together then those four create the unified theory of psychology.
And does that have much to do with, is there an ethical component to that? Because I was thinking somebody could have very high sense of high value about themselves and be a total asshole, and another person can be really have qualities that are very good and look be very down on themselves and
absolutely right. So the overarching ethic from the unified theory comes from a slightly different place, but this is unbelievably relevant for both our character and then ultimately what we're going to value from an ethical informed perspective. So right now, this is just a description of it, but the description of it will inform our nature. And from that, we'll actually understand why we make the valuations that we do, why we choose to.
Okay. I see. Yeah.
So now what we're actually doing here is we're jumping over into mapping how individuals grow and adapt. This is the key word here is adaptation. Okay. And what this is this maps the core systems of adaptation. all right, that have evolved, and it maps them so that we can understand, in particular, relative to sort of like, well, what are adaptive versus maladaptive pathways? So these are adaptive systems that they can be tracked for entrenched, what we call in the psychotherapy world, entrenched maladaptive patterns. Okay. And the argument, actually, remember when we started this whole thing, I said the problem of psychotherapy is that we have what I believe we have is really these different mental systems, but we don't have a system for putting them together.
Yeah.
Okay. So this then says, hey, if we had a system that actually had the right language, instead of thinking of behaviorism, we would talk just about the habit system. Okay. Instead of talking about the emotion and experiential humanistic therapies, we would just talk about the emotionally grounded experiential system. Okay. Instead of looking at modern psychodynamic approaches that look at the underlying relationship system in terms of its power, love, and freedom needs, and then the defenses of the ego, we would just understand that modern psychodynamic theory focuses on patterns of relationship, implicit, and then the way we defend our egos. And then the cognitive model would focus on the explicit systems of justification that we build to make sense out of the world. Okay. So rather than remember, I was like, oh my God, the cognitive model makes sense, psychodynamic, behavioral, and humanistic. This would say, actually, just like a model of psychological science would say, oh, there's a habit system, experiential system, a relational system, a defensive system, a justification. People collections of these different psychotherapies have focused on different patterns of maladaptive that can then be made aware of and reversed, and they operate with different mechanisms, basically, or models. But we can put them all together with this kind of system.
So in a practical sense, you might look at a patient and say that he needs to work on well, it would be more appropriate for him to work on his relationships, and other ones, it would be more appropriate to work on the habits.
Completely.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. So if I was like a generalist psychological doctor, you'd come in, I'd be able to assess you all. But if you had, say, borderline personality disorder, a serious problem with the relationships and your emotion, I'd be able to send you off and work with that guy. Okay. But if you wanted to come to me and you had a habit problem with smoking, all right, then there would be a behavioral expert who was like, okay, I'm really focused on habit change. All right. If I was more interested in existential meaning making, we'd obviously want generalists, but we want to be able to potentially have specialization. But what this does is this is now all the same language system rather than all these different language systems.
Okay, I see.
Okay. And so this is the adaptation systems. And then these are the domains of character development that then give rise to a personality structure. Okay. So you may have heard of like the big 5 personality traits.
Yeah. Yeah. I've thought a lot of, yeah.
Okay. And then what is your identity? This is you as a person in terms of what your narrative is. What are the domains of virtue and values that you try to cultivate, and what's your worldview? That's, of course, going to overlap with identity, but they're also separable. What are the talents and abilities that you have? Okay. And then what are the challenges and pathologies that you struggle with? And it's in the shape of a wheel with character adaptation, means that this cast sits in sort of on the axle, and then across the process of engagement, each of these have domains of development. And if you're familiar with Wilber, you can think about the lines of development, the domains of traits, domains of identity, the various domains of virtues. You can then think about how they would grow and operate in different contexts and different people and be at different lines of development. So this is where this would overlap with Wilber's view. So this is the wheel of development. So we've gone then from understanding. So now we're like, okay, yeah, how do you cultivate a healthy, and then what gives rise to unhealthy adaptation? And then we put that over time. And then what are the domains of development? And so these together create a picture of character. Then this next model is the nested model of well-being. And this is a map of what do we mean by the concept of well-being. The term well-being gets kicked around a lot. Yeah. But people actually don't have a good map about what it actually is made of and how to actually model it in its entirety. And what this says is it starts with your subjective first-person experience. You have the experiential, which is generally organized by your emotions. This means positive and negative emotion or affect. And then you have your narrator, which makes a general evaluation of satisfaction, like, hey, how's on a scale of 1 to 10? And then it will have specific domains of satisfaction, like, hey, I'm satisfied with my relationship with my wife, but my work is going shit. I'm anxious about my finances, but I like my living arrangements. Okay? Now, then you're nested as an organism. This subjectivity is nested. One is the dimension of the mental, which corresponds to the psychological. Okay? Domain, this is what I, as a psychological doctor, would assess in you from a third-person doctor perspective. Okay? So you might say I've met people who say they're really happy, and I would say, yeah, but you're not functioning very well. Okay? Okay. And then
or somebody's functioning very well and they're extremely unhappy. They're just, their life is perfect, but they're asking this question, why?
If you're miserable by definition, you cannot have high well-being and be miserable. Okay. By definition, you can have other values. But if you're like, I hate my life and I'm totally depressed, that would be inconsistent. But it's also not the case just to say that you're happy. That means that's not the same thing as high well-being. Okay. So you have to take subjective perspective into account, and then psychological functioning, and then your biomedical physiological functioning, both in terms of any malfunctioning elements and then vulnerabilities in the overall coherence of your biophysiology. Okay. And then we place you in the environmental context, which you can divide sort of at its base at the material level, like what's the biophysical ecology? For example, is there any toxins in the area? What's the temperature? What natural resources do you have available? Okay. Then we can move into technological elements, and then we get up more into society and culture, like what's your social role? Are you a minority? Do you have economic resources? What are the norms? What are the relational domains that you experience? Okay. And then finally, the worldview of the evaluator, okay, values what is good and evil. How do we understand the person? You have to take this into consideration because well-being is inherently a normative concept that involves a prescriptive element about what is good and what is bad from the vantage point of the evaluator. All right. And then it is the alignment of these elements that is the nested model. And it actually aligns a lot with what the short summary statement that Kant gave for what Immanuel Kant gave for what is well-being, and that is happiness with the worthiness to be happy. And we can think about that in terms of, okay, you have this is happiness, and the worthiness means your function is psychologically, biologically, materially, socially, and you are living in accordance with a set of values that the evaluator deems worthy and good.
That's the meaning aspect, which I guess Jordan Peterson talks so much about.
Absolutely. You have to get into that and we know that people have trade-offs. In fact, parents, for example, have trade-offs. Like, what's your hedonic value? Are you happy? You have freedom? Or do you have meaning and purpose? Many parents will report that their general stress goes up, their levels of hedonic value go down, meaning they're not as happy because they're so stressed taking care of kids. And at the same time, their meaning and purpose goes up because now they've given rise to another life.
I know. I have a 1-year-old.
Oh my gosh, I've got a 1-year-old. So my kid's right.
I've got a 10-year-old and a 1-year-old. So
wow. I hope your meaning's high because I know you're straight. Got to be. I'm dealing with a 1-year-old, right? Yeah. My kids are older, 16, 19, and 21. So we're on the back half of adolescence and into young adulthood. And then finally, I already spent some time talking about the 8th branch. This is that metacognitive observer that creates psychological, not meditative, but psychological mindfulness, and then creates an internal sage that's curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, and motivated to grow toward valued states of being. So this is the theory of knowledge tree, and you have in the middle you have this metaphysical empirical flower, which basically gives rise to this dimension. So what are the ultimate concepts and categories? And then the broad paradigms and theories into more narrow paradigms that then have specific causes that give rise to hypotheses that then make predictions about particular data. So this is the continuum. of understanding that you want aligned on a dialectic. And this is why ultimately it intentionally spells what the big me and the little me means, and ultimately gives rise to meme. Okay. So on the left-hand side, you have the unified theory. Okay. That's what the UT is there. On the right-hand side, you have the unified approach. You also have the theory of knowledge. And that's why there's a TOK in there. All right. And then so this is the tree in and of itself. This is what it's a metaphysical, empirical, pure reason, unified theory of psychology, practical reason, unified approach to psychotherapy, new theory of knowledge that bridges philosophy and psychology into science.
That's quite a cathedral you got there.
So yeah, thank you. Yeah,
thank you, and I'm very glad you took me through that, because I would have probably had a hard time going through it on my own. I mean, I would have seen a bunch of diagrams and my mind would have sort of like turned off. But when you take me through it, I get excited about it.
Oh, good. Yeah, the basic argument.
When I see scientific
people will say, "Oh my
diagrams," but there's also I guess you have an artistic component there as well, which is nice.
Well, it's me reaching out to your poetic side. You know, I'm raised as a scientist, and I try to basically say, "Oh, I'm going to go to the human side scientifically." Then I realize that it's a chaos. It's chaos trying to sense make based on the grammar that we're given, and then they try to reduce it to the scientific method. And you can't do it actually because the grammar itself is broken. But then I figured out a way to get the grammar right, and then I organized a lot of the science, and then I came back out the other side and said, "Oh my gosh, we can give this to the poets."
Yeah, well, that's the thing I find actually is when I'm listening to a really intelligent scientist, like somebody like Brett Weinstein or something, and I'm going, wow, he's just incredible, this guy. He's got such an amazing mind, but he doesn't know shit about religion, or poetry or literature, or I'm sorry, Brett Weinstein, he probably knows more than I'm giving him credit for, but I often get the sense that there's this whole other domain of reality, because he's specialized so much in science, that there's this whole other domain of reality, which so when we have a conversation between him and like an Orthodox priest like Jonathan Pageau, they're not connecting.
Right, because he's trained. What the modernist people are trained is that the real truth is in logos. Yeah. And that the scientific method gives you objectivity.
And that's the highest thing in the world. And
that's the highest thing.
We have to move up to that, right?
Right. But he actually, the point of it though, is that he doesn't know how to then loop himself and his brother and every other human individual he knows back into the system. He only knows how to speak from the evolutionary biological level. Okay. And so he does not know how to get through evolutionary biology into human psychology. I listen to him all the time. I think he's brilliant.
Yeah, me too. That's exactly right. That's the same impression I have, that there's just a sort of tragedy of not being able to take that next kind of that bridge over. You say into psychology, and my domain is more in the spiritual and the artistic world, but there's people that everybody, there's this, the modernist people are always talking about how we have to go back to this modernist worldview, which is, fact-based and empirical based and
right.
Whereas they have no conception of Carl, like Sam Harris. He just has no conception of Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche and all these people. They're just idiots to him, because all they can see is this empirical model or something.
Right. So what like E.O. Wilson wanted consilience, and to get that you have to have natural science, like STEM science, what we conceive of. But they break down in social science because of the problem of psychology. The tree of knowledge puts psychology and the social sciences on top of physics and biology. That's the conciliant picture. Okay. And it says that's a justification system, just like Wilbur identifies. This is an exterior epistemology, but holistically, it's clapping with one hand. It's only one side of the epistemological system, right? You need the interior individual and interior group to create truth, goodness, and beauty. Wilber sees that. All right. And I see that.
Yeah.
Okay?
Sure.
So then the tree of knowledge says, okay, now we can actually fill in the right-hand side with what I call men's knowledge, which is modernist versus pre-modern formal, empiricist, okay, natural science, modernist, empirical, natural science, men's knowledge, all right? And then obviously it's called men's, and you're like, what the hell is that? And it's then I want to give rise to the postmodern critique, right? Postmodern critique is that we yoked dominant knowledge and power. This is Foucault, right?
Sure.
Knowledge and power get fused together, and the systems say, oh, this is transcendental truth, but they also happen to be transcendental truth that benefits who? White Christian European men that gets colonially distributed throughout the world and stacks them up. Okay. So what do we need?
Sure.
We need to understand science as a justification system and the truths it can give us, but realize that it's actually just that, a system of justification. It does certain things very well, but it certainly isn't everything. We need a wisdom-oriented framing of men's knowledge. So we transform men's knowledge into holistic women's knowledge, all right? And that's what we need in the 21st century. That is a scientific, humanistic bridge between the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities.
Okay, so the analogy or the metaphor is almost the bringing of together the masculine and the feminine principle in some way.
Exactly, completely. The hardcore analytic pure reason and the wisdom, soft, therapeutic, practical reason to cultivate our heart and soul with our logos. So they can then blend our mythos, our logos, and our pathos for an ethos for the 21st century. That's what I mean by a unified theory of knowledge.
So we've been going for 2 hours now. I think my brain is a bit fried, but at the same time, I'm wired and excited by your formulation, and
Good. Well, we are talking in a week. Me and you.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm glad that we did this before that conversation,
right?
Which will enable me to be a better, perhaps, interlocutor between you two guys.
I love talking with Bard. We have slightly different versions. I can't believe how much our versions overlap, which is cool. And I hope to support him in the ways I can, and I think vice versa. And there's only minor areas of disagreement, so it's really quite remarkable. Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, that's great. It often feels like you're coming from such a totally, in many ways, different perspective than Bard. But yes, there's many crossovers because Bard is just in the pure philosophy and art realm, and I guess he knows a lot of science as well. So yeah, but it's
no, he does. He certainly knows what I was transformed by his book Syntheism. Totally transformed. I was already on the cusp of I've dropped my new atheist view. I was raised sort of in the new atheist Dawkins view. I'd already scuffed that off, but I was looking for something else. The tree of knowledge would talk about sort of the fifth joint point. What it says is that the world of the digital, okay, the world of the digital is the next information communication age.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it says. So each one of those, remembers information system, communication. Now we built this other information communication system. So I knew once I built the tree of knowledge, it's like, oh shit, the 21st century is going to be intense. Okay. And it scared me because it meant, well, what's going to happen? And so to think about the digital and to think about God and to think about the God we create in the 21st century and to think about, okay, we need to shed theism and atheism to create a synthetic view and God in the digital age and the God we create. I read that book and I was just like, damn, that's exactly what completely. This is why I called to turn my thing into a garden. You know, I was like, oh my God, this is all this sort of this idea of orienting them towards the future with wisdom. And that's why I have so much respect for what Bard was doing and why I was so very moved by it.